Good evening and welcome to the 2020 For Hope, for Humanity Holocaust Memorial Museum benefit. On behalf of the Jewish Federation Board of Directors and the HMMSA Commission, we thank you for joining us tonight. This event would not be possible without our wonderful sponsors, our champion sponsor, the Mays Family Foundation, and our benefit ambassadors, our event advocates, our friends of the museum, the following additional generous sponsors and donors, and of course, to Dr. Linda Solis, whose leadership as the chair of our museum commission, as well as the event steering committee, without whom we could not have shifted to so successfully from the in-person event scheduled for last March to tonight's virtual program. Thank you all. This year's honorary event chairs are Louise and Michael Belden. We join them in celebrating the For Hope, for Humanity honorees, Charles E. Cheever of blessed memory, Charles Cheever Jr., Chris Cheever, and their families. 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau, where both Charles E. Cheever and Mike Belden's father, Maury, freed one of the largest concentration camps during World War II. It is an honor to commemorate both heroic men who embody the spirit of our museum's work, and their families who continue to lead by example with their dedication and philanthropic support. The Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio is the only Holocaust education center within 300 miles, serving educators, students, and visitors in South Texas. Each year, more than 18,000 visitors pass through the museum's exhibit halls, hear survivors' testimony, and take part in educational programs. In memory of the 6 million Jews and the other innocent victims of the Holocaust, the museum teaches the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and apathy, and promotes good citizenship, democratic values, and respect for human dignity. This event, the For Hope, for Humanity biennial benefit, raises the critical funds that will enable our museum to operate for the next 2 years. Tonight, we have been presented with a wonderful opportunity by Charles E. Cheever III and Renee and Marty Wender, who have combined their philanthropic efforts to provide a matching 2-for-1 challenge gift. For every $1 you donate between now and this Friday, October 30th, their donations will generously match your dollar with 2 additional dollars. Your gift will go 3 times as far, so please visit hmmsa.org/donate after the program to make your contribution of support. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce a special friend to the museum, Robert Rivard. Robert is the editor for the San Antonio Report. He is the former editor of the San Antonio Express News and was named Editor of the Year in 2001. Robert was also the recipient of Columbia University's Maria Moore's Cabot Prize for Distinguished Journalistic Service in 2002. Welcome, Robert.
Good evening, NAMI. Thank you, and thank you to everyone in the audience this evening for the Jewish Federation of San Antonio event. It's an honor for me and for all my colleagues at the San Antonio Report to associate ourselves with you and with the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio. I have to comment, you have some great San Antonians and the Cheevers and the Beldens and the Wenders behind you this evening, so I'm sure you're going to reach your goal. But it's my pleasure tonight to share a conversation with our author, Eli Saslow, a Washington Post reporter, a very distinguished one, I might add, Pulitzer Prize winner in 2014 for a really penetrating series into food insecurity in America and the millions of families depending on a thin lifeline of food stamps to get by. It's called American Hunger. And if you've already been engrossed by his book, Rising Out of Hatred, which we're here to talk about, I would suggest you jump on Amazon and download his Washington Post series, which I did. It's an amazing story, and it could have been written right now in the pandemic, even though it was written 6 years ago. Eli, welcome to San Antonio, virtually speaking.
Thanks so much. Wish I was actually there, but yeah, feel grateful to be with you all and talking to you. Thanks for making time for it.
Well, your book is has been out now for 2 years, but it's extraordinarily prescient and timely in that it taps into the rise of white supremacy in America. And I thought I was a fairly well-informed journalist, Eli, but until I read the book, I had no idea how. I knew white supremacy was broad. I had no idea it was so deep. I thought it was thin, but I've come to conclude otherwise. On the other hand, reading your book left me with a very unexpected sense of hope and redemption that I took out of your story, which I'd like you to talk about. But it did also leave me a bit shaken about how deep this sentiment is among so many people and their fear of Blacks, Hispanics, Jews, anybody different than them, and how that fear feeds their hatred and this distorted view that America was always meant to be a white country for whites and at the exclusion of everyone else.
Yeah, and the truth is, I was equally sort of embarrassingly ignorant, I think, about how deep these problems run, and not just that, but how present they are in terms of how white supremacy still informs so much of what happens in the United States and where we're at politically. Whether that's the huge rise in anti-Semitism that we've seen over the last 5 years, or whether it's the way we talk about policing in this country and Black Lives Matter, or anti-refugee rhetoric, the immigration conversation that has become increasingly heated. All of these are sort of have some of the tenets of white nationalist ideology at their root, and I think that's why they're so explosive, because in the United States, white supremacy has been sort of part and parcel of who we are, and confronting these problems really requires confronting the basic facts of the United States.
Well, talk to us a little bit about young Derek Black and his father, Don Black, and their association with David Duke, which is one name that I think everyone on the program will be familiar with. The subtitle of your book is The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist, which hints at why there's hope and redemption in this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a story that I stumbled into, which I'm sure has happened to you, I hope, many times in your career. And in this case, I had gone to a real place of darkness. I was in Charleston, South Carolina, 5 years ago, writing about what had become sort of another in a frequent string of white nationalist terrorist attacks in the United States. This one perpetrated by Dylan Roof, who had gone into a historically Black church and killed 10 people in an attempt to start a race war. He was a huge anti-Semite, racist, and he'd come to a lot of these conclusions on a website called Stormfront, which up until that point, I didn't know anything about, fortunately. Stormfront, I then went on to learn about Dylan Roof and to see what he'd been reading. Stormfront is a massive online community, global community, translated every day into 5 languages, 300,000 active users. It's a place where neo-Nazis meet Nazis, meet KKK, meet also sort of racist academics who publish false papers about the science of race. And this is the place where Dylan Roof had come to these conclusions. When I went on Stormfront, just coincidentally, I stumbled into another message thread, which was the biggest thread on the message board. And it was about Derek Black. I'd never heard of him before. But in this way, I started to sort of read about his biography. Derek was kind of the crown prince, the young rising star of this white nationalist movement. He's the son of Don Black, who had built this message board and who had been the head of the KKK in the United States in the late 1970s. His godfather is David Duke, I think the most notorious racist politician of modern times, with increasing competition from all corners, unfortunately. But I think these two men had sort of raised Derek within this bubble of white nationalist, white supremacist ideology. And Derek, because he was very smart and also very ambitious, invested himself in these ideas in really disastrous ways. He had a daily radio show by the time he was 16 on the mainstream airways in Florida. He became sort of the keynote speaker at a lot of these conferences, these racist conferences throughout the South. He ran for office in Florida when he turned 19 years old and won a seat on the Republican committee in Palm Beach, Florida, not by announcing himself as a racist, but by going around and talking to voters, using a lot of really racist talking points. Like, isn't it too bad we have all these signs in Spanish here now? Don't you think there's more violence in the inner city because of the kind of people who are in the inner city? And by using this sort of coded racist language, Derek was able to get elected with 70% of the vote. And he was really kind of at the peak of this movement, telling these other white supremacists that the way ahead for them was through politics. And then to further his own career, he went to college. He went to the best and cheapest school he could afford, which was the New College of Florida. It's an honors college in Florida. And at this school, when the other students found out who Derek was, a massive transformation began to take place over the course of 4 years. And that really is the story that is told in the book.
And very strange things happen on that college campus. There's some young heroes in this book. Only one Orthodox Jew in the entire student population, Moshe, who, to my astonishment, invites this white supremacist over to participate in Shabbat, which is astonishing that he would reach out like that. And a young woman who becomes an increasingly important character in the book, and ultimately Derek's girlfriend, Allison. And just talk about some of the young people there that, instead of shunning or ostracizing this young man who was the crown prince of the white supremacy movement in America, just sort of seen by everyone as the young sun king and heir apparent, they decided they were not going to do that. They were going to take a different tact.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened on that campus was really remarkable, and also I hope in some ways a small model for what some of us can do now in confronting the anti-Semitism and the racism that's all around us. The first choice that students on that campus made when they learned who Derek was, they decided to engage. They made the choice to do something. There was no apathy on that campus. The students did not say, well, we're never going to change his mind. He thinks way differently than us. He's never going to listen to us. Let's just go to class and ignore him. They all decided we have to prioritize this, and we have to do everything we can to eradicate it. For some students, what they decided to do was shun him and to sort of protest his presence on campus, to make him feel uncomfortable. And I think that there was heroism in that too, because first of all, some Jewish students on campus, some students of color, they didn't feel safe or comfortable going up to Derek and trying to change his mind. Understandably so. Derek had been saying awful, inhumane things, online for years, and he still had this huge racist community at his fingertips on Stormfront. So those students shut down the school in protest of Derek being there, and I think that action began to affect Derek, and it made him feel more vulnerable, and it made him question if all of these smart students at this campus could be wrong. And that vulnerability, I think, really opened Derek up when some other students, like the ones you mentioned, Matthew, Moshe, Allison, made the opposite choice and decided, let's try to reach out to this guy. Let's try to start having a conversation with him. And more than just a conversation, let's see if we can potentially befriend him, become people to him, so that he can maybe see beyond the stereotypes, beyond the racism, beyond the anti-Semitism, and instead start seeing all of us, the people sitting across from him at this table, and maybe that will wear away at some of his hateful ideas. So that was a 3-year-long effort. It wasn't just one dinner that they invited him to. It was week after week, Friday night after Friday night, over the course of years. And I think it's that kind of sustained work that's required sometimes to change sort of the fundamental problems that we're up against. And it was those students who did it.
So there was this strange period of slow transition where Dylan is calling in on the internet to join his father for this daily or weekly radio show spewing hate and bigotry and racism. And then he's on campus and he's befriended a young Latino, Juan, a couple of people of Jewish faith. I think somebody was gay in the mix. All the things that he was vilifying on his radio show and on the Stormfront website. And yet here he was finding these people were genuine humans, and they were the only ones on campus that were embracing him and saying, we're going to treat you like a human. And that became a pathway, I suppose, for them to challenge his thinking, or to even cause himself to challenge his thinking.
Yeah, I think also once Derek began to sit at that table every week and hear stories about these other people's lives, it became increasingly impossible for him to tell himself the false story that a lot of white nationalists, and frankly a lot of white people in the United States, continue to tell themselves, which is that Derek believed he was the person who had been persecuted. He was the person who somehow had been discriminated against. Polls consistently show that about 40% of white people in America somehow continue to believe that they experience more prejudice, more discrimination than people of color or Jews. And Derek was firmly in that camp. But when he began hearing the stories from the other people at this table, from Juan, who was an undocumented immigrant in the country and had gone through all kinds of issues, or from a student who'd been stopped and frisked on the streets of Orlando for being Black again and again growing up, or particularly I think from people like Matthew and Moshe. Moshe's own family history had been defined by the Holocaust. His grandfather had been imprisoned, had been malnourished. Most of his family had been wiped out there, and that was the definitive issue sort of in Moshe's young life growing up in Miami Beach. So when Derek began hearing all of these things from people he began to like and trust, it became impossible for him then to deny the existence of the Holocaust, or for him to continue to say he had been the victim at that table. And I think that was one of the first key points in the changing of some of his ideas.
And talk about his moment of repudiation and the difficulties he had in standing up to his own family and his own father, who had been his sort of senior partner in crime for years, in really breeding him to be this person. And then the reaction of the white supremacist community at large, because he was a rock star, a young rock star of the community, with his long hair and guitar and his black cowboy hat and this persona he had as a teenager. And it shook that world.
Yeah, it really shook that world. And I think Derek in some ways was no different from a lot of us in the fact that his ideas, his racist ideas, were to him very much tribal. They were about family. They were about his family, and they were about his own self-identity. Like that, those were the things. Even after all of these students had changed his mind about the facts of race, about the tenets of white nationalism, the thing holding Derek to these hateful ideas was his family. He knew that if he publicly repudiated this stuff, and even more so if he worked to advocate against it, he would probably never talk to his family again. They would disown him. This world that he had lived in for the first 21 years of his life, he would be entirely cutting it off. And in fact, that's what happened. Once Derek wrote a public letter to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a major anti-racist nonprofit in the United States, when this letter became public, it created a massive uproar on not just places like Stormfront, but all across the global diaspora of this white nationalist movement. And since then, his father has not spoken to him, much, or rebuilt much of a relationship with him. Derek had to initially change his name and sort of go into hiding because all of these KKK groups, neo-Nazis, considered him a major traitor to their movement. So I think Derek's steps to become increasingly public over the last years have come in part at a risk to his own safety, which I think he believes rightfully is worth taking. I think the only, not because it's courageous for him, but I think he thinks that the only decent thing to do, the only sort of fundamentally human thing to do, is to step up against racist, anti-Semitic, hateful ideology whenever we have the chance. So I think that's where he's turned his life into doing that work.
Eli, you came across this string on Storm Force, just as all of this had happened. And so he did retreat from the white supremacy world. He changed his name legally. He moved away. His real passion academically, and he was a very good student, were medieval studies. He was actually a doctoral student and went on in that direction. The reporter in you obviously saw, this is a great story, only there's no protagonist. Where is he? He's disappeared. So tell us the story of how you found him, and equally challenging, convinced him that it was a story that had to be told.
Yeah, and it was also sort of, I think, made more challenging by the fact that it wasn't just me trying to find him, right? It was also all of these people who wanted to do him real harm. So when I did eventually find Derek, which was not, I knew what he had studied in undergrad. I knew that he was a really smart student and an ambitious student. So I knew that there were a fairly small number of graduate schools that he was likely to end up at. And I found somebody enrolled in one of those graduate schools with the same last name, different first name, was able to do some Google image searching. I mean, it was not, it was not extraordinarily difficult. What was much more difficult was then winning his trust once I got in touch, because initially Derek said, no, I'm not ready to talk about any of this. I don't ever want to talk about any of this. And I think the truth is, over the next year, I worked on other stories, other pieces. We continued to email sometimes. And I'm sure we built up some rapport. I think the bigger thing that happened over the course of that next year, which was 2015 into 2016, is that Derek saw all of these awful, insidious, racist talking points that he'd worked to spread. He saw these seeds that he'd planted growing all around him, and I think, whether that was in a lot of police shootings that year, whether it was sort of in a presidential candidate who at that point was talking about Mexicans as racist trying to come across the border, or talk about banning Muslims from coming into the United States, or at an event like Charlottesville, where Derek had watched the videos of hundreds of people on the streets chanting "Jews will not replace us," things that he himself had said and spread again and again on the radio. I think he felt terrified for the direction the country was going. He knew the power of this ideology historically in the United States, and he felt like even if it wasn't something he wanted to do, the only thing to do was to become increasingly public. So I think, unfortunately, it was the darkness of this stuff spreading in the world that really compelled him.
And he had a very strong young woman at his side, Allison. I don't know if that she became his wife, but certainly partner. And she convinced him, you have a moral debt to pay for the damage that you've done. And that led to not only the work that he did with you, but the op-eds that he ended up writing for the New York Times, which were very powerful. That's probably the publication that white supremacists loathe the most.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think Allison, who initially was one of the students who thought the best thing to do on campus was to protest and shun Derek, her roommates were Matthew and Moshe, and they began inviting Derek over. And she became very curious about him. She didn't understand how somebody who would show up at the apartment and act decently to other people could also be a person who would write and say these terrible things on the internet. And she made it a project for herself to figure out how he had come to these awful conclusions. And as that relationship intensified into first debates and really long arguments about the ideas of race in the country, it fueled a tight friendship and then a tight relationship that now is a marriage. And yeah, I think Allison is very instrumental still in holding Derek to the best of himself, which hopefully we all have people in our own lives and our own communities that hold us accountable to, not just not thinking hateful things, but also to fighting back against racist thinking. I mean, there's an author who I admire a lot named Ibram X. Kendi, who writes a lot about race and has become prominent doing so in the last few years. And he says something that I think resonates a lot, I know, with Derek, which is that in the United States, there's no such thing as being not a racist. Our country has furthered and grown racism and prioritized the interests of white people since its founding. And the racist stream of ideas flows freely here. So you're either doing nothing and allowing that stream of ideas to continue to flow and grow, or you are being anti-racist and you are actively fighting back against the anti-Semitism and the racism that we see all around us, not just in places like Stormfront, but also in our much more mainstream political places, in all of our Facebook feeds. And I think all of us can engage to fight back against that.
Eli, there's a remarkable confluence between this Stormfront website, which, to remind our audience, this was founded, created, conceived by Derek's father, Don. And it was an extraordinary success in leveraging the arrival of the internet to knitting together this national and, in fact, global network of racists who previously had no real connectivity, nothing approaching this. An astonishing number of the active shooter incidents involving race and hatred those individuals were Stormfront users. And in fact, you mentioned Dylan Roof. And there's some other contemporary figures that they may not be household names yet, but I want to bring up the name of Richard Spencer and have you talk about him a little bit. He was at Charlottesville marching in that infamous now rally that led to the death of one of the counter protesters and the injuries of many others when one of the white supremacists drove his vehicle into the counter protesters. He has set up shop in and around Washington, D.C., and there's quite a remarkable network of different organizations and entities that are all like-minded, trying to whitewash white supremacy to make it more acceptable, taking off the Klan sheets, not embracing language like the N-word, and trying to normalize white supremacy.
That's exactly right, and I think it's sort of the sanitization of the language that has helped some of these ideas spread, and that's also something Derek was a big part of. I mean, he convinced his father and David Duke to begin banning racist slurs and Nazi insignia on Stormfront, which is, you know, a place where that stuff was bedrock. But by banning that language, by trying to encourage all of these white supremacists to talk not in the language of slurs or crassness, but instead to talk about the false science of IQ differentials, which is not true, and things like that, it makes these racist talking points much more palatable to a mainstream white audience. You know, and Richard Spencer is somebody who's really capitalized on that. He sort of rose into Derek's place in this movement and went on a national speaking tour of college campuses, went to 15 schools where he often had big crowds and spread these racist ideas. And probably not coincidentally, on college campuses, these incidents of racist and anti-Semitic graffiti have quadrupled in the last 5 years.
Well, and on the other side of it, I was struck in a conversation you and I had earlier about I don't know if it was Pew Research or whatever, about the rising number of Americans, young Americans, that don't have a grasp of the Holocaust, and even the numbers that are engaged in Holocaust denial. And we must not be teaching it very well in American schools. It must not be part of it. And this larger conversation now about how race has informed the entire development of the United States all the way through the Civil War and the aftermath of that we're still engaged in. It just doesn't seem to be something that the American public education system has played a useful role in educating people from an early age what they need to understand to be informed citizens about these issues.
It's really terrifying. You know, I think 1 in 10 millennials says that they have not heard of the Holocaust. More than half believe that fewer than 2 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. You know, I think, and I do think education is partly at fault. I think, you know, we like to tell ourselves a scrubbed, clean version of our history. You know, we like to turn away from the ugliest parts of what we've been. At least, you know, white Americans like to, because they can afford to forget some of these atrocities. You know, and I think telling a much more honest version of the country's history and global history is essential to avoid falling into some of these same mistakes. And I think that that's particularly crucial now, in a moment where there's, you know, truth itself is sort of besieged. You know, the idea of any sort of consensus about anything, not just the Holocaust, but, you know, what's happening in our country, it almost doesn't exist. We're so polarized. We cultivate our own news feeds through our Facebook pages, where we hear from people who think like us. Conspiracy theories are on the rise. You know, and I think all of that is fueling some of this desire to turn away from and forget the worst parts of human instinct. And the only thing that we can do, I think, is to work hard to be much more honest about how awful and how bad this can get, because we've been down the worst parts of this road before, and I don't think any of us want to step any further in that direction.
Well, you're focused now on work for the Washington Post in exploring its impact on the lives of the impact of the pandemic and the social and economic shutdown on the lives of American families. And I think every journalist to some degree is engaged in that. And I think most of us find that under moments of social and economic pressure or downturn, that can bring out the worst fears in people about the other. We see it on, here in San Antonio and people's views toward immigration and the border, and particularly, people from Mexico or Central America that have been fleeing their own violence and terror and economic uncertainty down there. And I just wonder if in your encounters with families where you're really getting to know them, whether or not you find that their circumstances are causing them to resort to that sort of anti-social instinct.
There's no question. And worse than people resorting to that instinct, these white nationalist groups work hard to capitalize on moments like this. That's how they recruit. I mean, they go in online, in person, through all kinds of messaging to communities where they think that there are a lot of typically young, white, disaffected men. And what they say to these people essentially is, you're not having these problems in your life because of anything that's your fault. It's not because of what you're doing. It's not because of this pandemic or the economic collapse in 2008 or anything like that. It's because people are coming in and taking your power. They're coming in and they're taking your jobs. These people who don't look like you are transforming your country. They're turning it into something that no longer belongs to you in this really atrocious sense of ownership that has been a common theme for whites in America. And that's a really powerful message of fear to offer to people, because then those groups are also saying, you're like us. You're not actually out there all alone. You're with us, and we're an army. And what you can do is join us and fight back for the country that is rightfully yours. These are really problematic, dangerous, hateful ideas, but they're also really powerful. And white supremacist groups are taking advantage of this moment in exactly that way. And frankly, they'll continue to take advantage of that moment, no matter what the politics in our country look like a month from now or 10 years from now. This pandemic is going to leave a long tail of economic devastation. It's going to leave a long tail of pain and hurt. And that's the cocktail of where people often turn to hatred, fear, and nastiness. So I'm worried about all that.
Xenophobia. Well, it's been a very engaging conversation. I promised our sponsors that I would start it on time and finish it on time. So I'll Eli, I'd just like to say congratulations on Rising Out of Hatred. It's a deeply reported book and a very well written book, a page turner. And if people in the audience haven't read it, I would strongly urge you to do so. You're going to learn a lot more about topics that you think you know something about, but in fact, you'll learn much more about Rising Out of Hatred. Thank you, Eli Saslow. We look forward to the day when we can bring you to San Antonio and we can engage in person. Back to you, Nami.
Thanks.
Thank you, Eli, and thank you, Robert. This was an incredibly timely and relevant conversation, and we're appreciative for both of you joining us this evening to share the story with our audience. So now more than ever, ladies and gentlemen, the work of the Holocaust Memorial Museum is essential and critically meaningful to the next generation faced with a world of challenges. As you just heard, all the details are undeniable. Tonight, with your help and the generosity of Charles E. Cheever III and Renee and Marty Wender, your gift to the museum will go 3 times as far. Please consider donating at hmmsa.org before this Friday, October 30th, to support the work of the Holocaust and Holocaust education. Together, we aim to raise at least $30,000 over the next 3 days. Each year, thousands of students are personally impacted by the museum and express how it changes their outlook and their lives. We will close our program this evening by hearing from one of those students. Anna Grace Mako participated in the 2018 Holocaust Study Tour, a month-long course of study that culminated with a European Holocaust study experience. Anna Grace will now share the impact of this incredible journey. We apologize for the technical glitch. Anna Grace will share her story momentarily. Okay, while our back office attends to that, let me share with you. Oh.
Hi, I hope you are all enjoying your evening in this very special program. My name is Anna Grace Mako, and I'm currently a sophomore at the University of Texas in Austin. In 2018, as a high school junior, I was selected to participate in the Holocaust Studies seminar sponsored by the Jewish Federation of San Antonio and the Richard and Sue Carter Charitable Trust. The 5-month intensive program consisted of in-depth study, seminars, and guest speakers, and culminated in a 10-day trip to Eastern Europe, where we studied on-site at many historical locations. I was not prepared for the overwhelming and permanent impact this experience would have on me or the lessons of the Holocaust I would take away, the values of democracy, human rights, religious tolerance, and advocacy. Studying the Holocaust helped me put into perspective the countless number of lives beyond the Holocaust who continue to be oppressed and shut out daily all over the world, and I realized how important it is that these lessons of compassion continue to be far-reaching. The Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio serves more than 16,000 people per year, helping them grasp the enormity of the horrific period of time while educating them about the detrimental effects of hatred and intolerance. With each year, we want to continue growing and serving more people, but in order to do that, we need your help. The dollars raised at this evening's event fund 2 years of museum programming, and the more we raise tonight, the more we can reach in the next 2 years. So please go to our website to make a donation before sundown on Friday, October 30th. Now that you know the impact of the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio, we hope you, too, will help us fight hatred, prejudice, and apathy, making the world a better place for everyone. Hi.
Thank you, Anna Grace. Your experience with the Holocaust Memorial Museum is a testament to the work we do each day to bring a meaningful perspective and profound understanding to our community. Once again, thank you to our special guests, Robert Rivard and Eli Saslow, to the generous event sponsors, and to the many volunteers and docents who make the work of the museum possible. Please consider making a gift to the Holocaust Memorial Museum this week. Your gift to support Holocaust education and establishing a baseline of human dignity and respect. Your gift will go 3 times as far, and any amount you make will have an enormous impact. Thank you for joining us for the 2020 For Hope for Humanity Holocaust Memorial Museum benefit. Good night, and please stay safe.